Welcome to Transitions. I'm your host, Antoinette Zloty. Today I have some interesting guests for you to hear from. And two of them are Kirsti Kuuskivi and Gregory Gaskin. They'll share their personal story. Also, I have a guest. Her name is Vanessa Kornelsen. And she is a person who works in a very important position with IRCOM. IRCOM is the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organizations of Manitoba. So first I'll turn to Kirsti. And Kirsti, can you share your story with us?
Okay. I arrived in Canada on June 20th, 1957. I was 8 years old at the time and moved with my mother and father, who were 38 and 28, and 10-year-old brother and 1-year-old sister. My father already had a job lined up as a painter decorator. So initially we ended up living in a motel with a kitchenette until we could find rental accommodation. I guess one of the funny stories that happened right from the start, we were living in the motel by Lake Boulevard, and my brother and I went grocery shopping, but we spoke no English. And we had to go to Bay Street so we could speak Finnish. And yes, we took a long walk for blocks and blocks on a hot summer day. It must have taken us about probably 2 hours, for the trip there and then back. And by that time, I'm sure the milk was curdled. But yes, when I think back about it, that was quite funny that we could not just go to a store that was nearby because of our lack of English language. Then in the fall, we both started school. I was put back into grade 1. In Finland at that time, and I believe that still is true, you start grade 1 at age 7. I was put back to grade 1 for half a year until my English language was advanced enough. Then I was put into grade 2. And then lo and behold, by 3rd grade, I realized that I had covered grades 1 to 3 in Finland in my one year of school. So I thought that was different. I guess in terms of adjustment to Canada, we lived in Thunder Bay, and there's a sizable Finnish community there. So, families were friends with each other. There was the Finnish Hall. There was a lot of supports there in that way. But there were no programs available for English language or whatever. You needed to have a job ready, and you needed to have money to support your family. With my parents, we came here for, the land of opportunity. The economy may not have been as good in Finland at the time, but in years later it was. So with my parents, probably they had some regrets that they did move, because we have a number of family members in Finland and Sweden, and you lose those ties. But I guess the good story is that my husband and I traveled back to Finland for a vacation with my mother. By that time, my father had passed away. But we went back she met all her, her brother and her sisters. And that was a positive experience for her because I guess she had always idealized life in Finland being better. But she realized that she wanted to be back in Canada with her immediate family, her, children and grandchildren. And I think that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. We'll talk some more about immigration in a wider sense later on, but Gregory, would you share your story?
Hi. I arrived in Canada on January the 25th, 1977, at the age of 20. I came to Canada because I had an aunt living in Winnipeg, and she expressed to me, or she tried to instill in me, that there were better opportunities here in Canada. At the time when I left Barbados, I was already in the workforce. I was working for consulting engineers, and it was a little hard for me to decide to come, but nonetheless, I came. The night I arrived in Canada, it was a storm, a winter storm, and I can't remember what the temperature was, but it was very cold. The following day, I had to go to Wilco to pick up my first winter jacket and my first set of winter boots. I remember we got a ride there in the taxi, and after we had made the purchases, we had to take the bus home. And I had to walk across the parking lot, which was covered with snow. And at that time, it was extremely cold, and it was even hard to breathe, leaving the temperature of, I think it was around 30 degrees when I left Barbados, and arriving here, I assume it was around minus 30 degrees. So that was quite a change. Yes. After I had arrived in Canada, about 6 months, I had applied, or I had some references from Barbados, so I had applied for a job. And I didn't really receive any, I didn't receive any job, but I returned to school. I went to Red River Community College. And after graduating from Red River Community College, then some of the applications that I had put forward before, I went to, actually they called me before I was finished school and told me that they had a position for me. So I worked with the company here in Winnipeg for, I think it was around 3 years, and then after that, another opportunity came where the city of Moose Jaw was hiring, and I had applied for one of the positions, and I was accepted, and I moved to Moose Jaw and worked there for 11 years, and then another opportunity in Manitoba came up, and I moved back to Winnipeg, and I've been here ever since. My experiences in Canada has been, I would say generally okay. I had no problems. So from the time I arrived in Canada, after I finished school, I'd worked, and I'm still working. I've never been without a job. And one of the things that made me really like Canada, or here in Manitoba, is the fact that society here, or the community here, was similar, and the things I did in Barbados, like where I could travel where I wanted to go, and the people were friendly, and that's what I found when I came to Canada. So I had great experiences.
Well, that's very, very good. And a lot of the experiences that you have had are very similar to me because given the fact that I'm also from Barbados, they've been some very positive experiences there and positive experiences here in Canada. The 24th of November 1968 was the date that I arrived in Canada with with 3 of my siblings. We came to Canada on that date because we were joining our parents who had come before to make way for us. And actually today I went online and I checked into tips for people who are considering coming to Canada. And I realized how fortunate I was to have been a child at the time, because my parents had to worry about all the documents. And also there weren't a lot of documents on me. My birth date, my birth certificate, my, my school and other kind of documents. Adults have a lot more that they have to put together. Anyhow, what I found in going to school in Brandon, Manitoba, was that I was the only black child in my class, and I look back at the pictures and I think, wow, that was really amazing as a teenager. Being the only child of color, I think I adjusted quite well, and I think that a lot of it had to do with the fact that being from Barbados, Barbados is a lot actually like Canada, except Canada is a bigger country, and my uncle, he's passed on now, but he was a wonderful man. He and his he and his wife had encouraged my parents to leave Barbados and immigrate to the bigger country. So I went to grade 8 in Brandon, and then we went to Portage-la-Prairie. Brandon seemed like a big city compared to Portage-la-Prairie, but then Portage was closer to Winnipeg. So when you're a teenager, you start thinking about things like that. What was kind of funny, a lot of funny and unusual things happened in those early years, and one of them in Brandon, I kind of laughed at a bunch of kids who said to me, you guys wore grass skirts in Barbados and you live in huts? And I'm like, no. As a matter of fact, I had to wear a uniform. We had to wear uniforms in Barbados. And these were uniforms patterned along the British lines, with the pleats, and the pleats had to be perfect. Mine were never as perfect as other kids in school, because that's what kids do. They still compare themselves with other kids, even when you have uniforms. And so I kind of had a good laugh. Anyhow, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us, and we'll be coming right back after I talk to Vanessa, and we can chat about immigration in general. Welcome back to Transitions. As I said earlier, Vanessa Kornelsen would be joining me, and here she is. She's going to tell us a bit about IRCOM.
Yes, IRCOM is the organization I work for. It stands for the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba. What we try to do is just help people adapt to life in Canada. So I know we've heard a few stories earlier about people who came to Canada a fairly long time ago. The people we work with are much more recent arrivals. So they tend to come within a year, the first year of being in Canada, they'll often end up at IRCOM. We do lots of different things. One of the main things that we do is provide housing. So we do have 2 apartment complexes that we operate. Both are owned by Manitoba Housing. And the apartments that we have are designated specifically for families. So it's for parents with children. Often it'll be a multi-generational family, and so we might also have a grandparent or 2 in there. And then on the first floor of both of our buildings, we have office space, we have programming space where we can provide supports, we can provide programming that help people adapt to life in Canada. And And so we tend to get a lot of higher needs families, so families that are facing multiple barriers to integration. So that could be single parents, it could be a person in the family has some sort of disability, or often we'll get families with lots of trauma in their background. And so because of the way that we're set up, we tend to work a lot more with refugees as opposed to provincial nominees or economic immigrants or those other classes of immigrants. I would say about 90% of the families who live in our buildings have a refugee background. And then of course we get people from the community as well who come just to access our services or our programs. So it ends up being a very vibrant community. There's people from all over the world. I think I counted a couple days ago and we had 19 countries represented between our two buildings, which is pretty amazing. So, you know, if you want to travel the world but you don't have a lot of money, you just come downtown and visit IRCOM. You can kind of get a little sample of lots of different cultures that way.
So it's interesting to me how agencies are coming up with really good ways to help people. And recently I made a donation for refugees, and that was a donation of clothing and other items. And so there are a lot of things that we can do now to help. We'll talk some more about that in the last segment of the show when Kirsti and Greg come back and we talk together as a group. But what I'd like to know though is that are you finding that there are quite a few people from certain parts of the world now as opposed to the past? And I guess the other day you mentioned something interesting about social media and media in general and how it's really impacts immigrants and refugees and how people think about them. And
so in terms of which countries people are coming from, right now the three highest populations that we have in our buildings are from Syria, Somalia, and Eritrea. So Syria is new in the last couple years, but Somalia and Eritrea have been sending refugees to us for a long time. When you're talking about social media and how that impacts the way people kind of understand the concept of immigration, I think what we were talking about at that time was just you know, some of the negativity that you hear around associated with the term immigrant or refugee. There's a lot of stereotypes that come with that. And just the point that I was making was, you know, my ancestors on my dad's side of the family, they came to Canada in like 1872, somewhere around there. And at that time, if people wanted to get news, you know, they would have had to wait for the newspaper to come. And if you happen to live in a rural setting, you know, how often would the newspaper actually get to you? And by the time it got there, how outdated would it be? As opposed to today, where everyone has an opinion and you can hear everyone's opinion instantly. And so if you get one person with a negative outlook, you know, back in the 1870s, it would have taken a week for it to get to you, and then you've got, you know, 2 weeks to kind of process it and think through what your opinion is of it, and you've got your family to talk it through with before the next piece of information comes in. Whereas today, you're being bombarded with those opinions and those ideas constantly, and so it's hard to kind of take the step back and sort through what is truth versus what is opinion, whose opinion counts for more, where do you want to see yourself fall in that conversation as well. And so I think that's where we're getting a lot of this negativity that's coming out. I think it's just people are forced to kind of respond that much faster. And so you don't necessarily get the time to think it through the way that you may have before.
Well, that's a very interesting information that you've provided, and I think that that really gives people some things to think about as well. when they hear information or when they share information is to really think about how it's affecting other people. So thank you, Vanessa, for sharing your information about IRCOM. We will be posting information as to the website, and so we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Transitions, and thank you for joining us. Now we are all together, and what we'd like to do is to talk a little bit about what is good in the system, or any new ideas that we may have, and just reflect on what we've heard today. So I'll start with you, Greg.
One of the things that I've noticed, and when I came back to Manitoba, is as an immigrant, if you want information and on how to be part of the big group here, you could turn to your local organizations. We have a local organization here, the Barbados Association, which is here to provide assistance and mentoring for immigrants coming from Barbados. We also are part of a bigger network, the National Council of Barbadians Associations in Canada. So anyone wishing, to join in or to, feel, part of the group can join these organizations at any time.
That's very good. So that's a really good aspect here in Winnipeg then, having that organization for Barbadians to join up.
Yes.
Or descendants of Barbadians too. Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you.
I think in Winnipeg here, we have various organizations representing various ethnic groups. We even have Folklorama once a year that celebrates everybody's culture. I know there are not a lot of Finnish people living in Manitoba in particular, but there is the Scandinavian Center that one can join with the other Scandinavian groups. And I guess from my experience, moving from Finland, where I only spoke Finnish, and then coming here to Canada and having to learn English, for my brother and I, it was a fairly easy transition. We picked up the language very well, but my parents were never able to learn to speak the language except at a very rudimentary level. They could understand English. In fact, my mother would carry on a conversation with her grandson, and he would speak in English and she would speak in Finnish, and they would carry on a conversation like that, and they understood each other. But I think for the population of immigrants and refugees that cannot speak English, English classes are very important, because if you don't have a command of the language, that limits your employment opportunities.
Actually, I think that's communication's the number one recommendation too for people who are considering coming to Canada is look at English and also French, depending on the region that you're going to be living in, and try to learn those languages in advance if they can, in advance of their arrival. So yeah, you've both really given some really good suggestions. And how about yourself, Vanessa?
So from what I know of what goes on in the rest of Canada, one of the really positive things about coming specifically to Manitoba is that the network of organizations who support people new to Canada are very well integrated. IRCOM works very well with lots of other organizations in Winnipeg with referrals and with supporting people and making sure that they don't fall between the cracks. So for example, if I know that somebody needs a service that's offered elsewhere, I will call a person there that I know, and I will tell them this person is coming to your organization, so that they're prepared. So that's a positive thing that happens in Manitoba.
That's excellent. That's really good. For my part then, I think that I'd like to see more jobs and job training earlier than, at age 18, maybe more testing and seeing aptitudes of kids and getting them streamlined earlier for positions, for jobs. Also then, I think that in thinking about what we've all had to contribute today, I think that we were very lucky to be among people who came with very supportive families, the three of us, and I hope that people out there who are also immigrants are encouraged by what we had to say, and we are very successful people in Canada, and we, I think, have done very well to contribute. So I would like to ask our viewers to please join us online, check out our website, and see some of the episodes that maybe you have missed, and maybe go to some of your favorite episodes. So keep tuning in to Transitions here at Shaw Channel 9, and also follow us on YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and thanks, guests, for being here.